Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to this this discussion. I don't even know anymore. Whatever you want to call it, welcome to it. Today we're going to be discussing something that's been kind of on my radar for the past couple weeks. Something I've been trying my best to kind of over-extensify and kind of cultivate in my mind a little bit. And that is, when in fact will we see The Winds of Winter be released? Now, this is something that's been kind of very, very highly anticipated in the BookTube community. I don't know if I'm necessarily a part of that. I've been dabbling a little bit with it as of late, but not necessarily, a full-fledged channel, dedicated to booktubing. But I've been recently getting into books recently since I finally graduated from college, yay me. Second, I actually do enjoy reading books and listening to audiobooks. They actually do surprisingly a lot of pleasure in my brain, surprisingly. So yeah, we're just gonna go with it. And to be fair, a lot of the biggest books, biggest authors tend to write these days not dystopian YA anymore, it's fantasy. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting into the fantasy realm. Every author is writing fantasy. A lot are great, like Brandon Sanderson and all that type of stuff. Someone that I didn't know 2 weeks ago, I had no idea who Brandon Sanderson was before 2 weeks ago, and now I'm fully aware of him and love a lot of his work that I'm currently reading as well, with the Cosmere and all that type of stuff. There's Patrick Rothfuss with his trilogy of books for the Kingkiller Chronicles that are huge fantasy and all that, and that's another book we'll talk about another day. But perfectly honest with you, the reason for all of this fantasy revolution, this fantasy renaissance that we're currently having right now in the book community and the book streamline, if you will, is because of the popularity of Game of Thrones. Yes, it's not single-handedly necessarily the reason behind this renaissance, but it is a big factor in this renaissance. Because these days, you can have a giant, overarching fantasy show on Amazon or Netflix or HBO or whatever, and actually look fairly similar in style to that of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Something that was a little too good for its own being, because every other fantasy type of thing that they tried to crack didn't necessarily work in the movie realm. So that's why they went over to the TV series, and HBO kind of led the way with Game of Thrones, the show. And of course, we know what happened to the Game of Thrones show, Season 8. Even though I haven't gotten to that part yet, I'm still stuck in Season 1 limbo. The Game of Thrones Season 8 was an absolute travesty on the best television series probably of our time. I don't know, maybe Breaking Bad has something to do with that being the greatest of all time as well. Better Call Saul is pretty good too. Anyway, it's one of the greatest series of all time, but that ending was absolutely the worst thing they could possibly have done. And I'm just saying it right here, it is not because of any of the directors or the cinematography people or the actors or the actresses, the set designers, the costume designers, any of those people. No, they tried their best. It was all because of Benioff and Weiss, who were absolute, just atrociously trying to rush this thing so they can be in Star Wars and do their Netflix deal and all that type of stuff, which, yeah, because they tried to rush it and they have a stink to their name now, they are out of Star Wars and they're more or less just out of Netflix. They haven't released anything in Netflix yet. They have something in development, but they're not really in... It hasn't released yet. So maybe something's kind of holding off a little bit. I don't know. But anyway, all this backstory kind of culminates to the Winds of Winter. Everyone that hated season 8 of Game of Thrones kind of did like the opposite effect for certain people when this type of thing tended to happen. Not a lot of people, when big, huge franchises tend to end on television or movies or whatever, not a lot of them tend to go and look at the books. Some of them do. Don't get me wrong, like Harry Potter, right? Harry Potter, in my opinion, stuck the landing when it came to the films. So not a lot of people tended to gravitate toward the books as much as they did with Game of Thrones, because everyone who hated season 8 are now gravitating toward the books to figure out how exactly it really ends. How does this story of some of the greatest fantasy characters of all time, how does their story truly end? And since season 8 of Game of Thrones, there's been a huge surplus of audience members and people ready and willing to read the next book in the franchise that is the Game of Thrones, The Winds of Winter. And in fact, the last novel in the franchise, I think it was A Clash with Kings or A Feast for Crows or something like that. I haven't gotten to that part in the series, so just bear with me. But the last book in the franchise, or the novel series, that came out in 2011, which, coincidentally, started A Game of Thrones, the show. And many people tended to agree that the reason why the show kind of ran off in the rails was because of Benioff and Weiss, but it was also partially due to George R.R. Martin not releasing the last 2 books of his huge franchise here. And I guess he kind of gave the cliff notes as to what's going to happen in the final 2 books, because there are certain things that are going to I'm just telling you, there are certain things that are going to happen in the books that did happen in the show, but I think they're going to be a lot more fleshed out and a lot better as opposed to what happened in the show, because these 2 writers were trying to rush it, and of course it tragically just ran off the rails. So in essence, I, as well as many of you people, have been asking for a very, very, very long time, why is The Winds of Winter taking so incredibly long for George to write? Well, in essence, I think it comes down to a few different aspects to George. And I don't know specifically about the author himself. I don't necessarily know everything that's going on in George's life, because I'm not necessarily a friend of his. I would like to be a friend of his, of course, but I'm not necessarily a friend of his. But coming from an outsider looking into his life, this is kind of the reasons why I believe it's taking a lot longer to get these things than others, you know? One of the reasons is because of his writing style. Now, George has expressed over and over and over again that he's a Gardner writer, and he, lets the characters flow and kind of do their own things. He doesn't have a plan. He never has had a plan or an outline or anything necessarily. When he's writing, he has an idea of what he wants to happen, but it kind of lets the characters in the world kind of flow through him and kind of figure out what exactly he wants to happen within the broad aspect of the story. Like, for instance, I don't necessarily know exactly how this happened or what aspect he did this in. I don't quite remember, but I remember that he wrote, like, someone was going to a wedding. I think it was the Red Wedding or something. but someone was supposed to come over to the wedding, and he wrote specifically a whole chapter, like 3 different ways, like what would happen to this guy that came over to the red wedding before, after, and during, and the aspects that would happen, kind of, what would happen after and all that type of stuff. And eventually, I guess he went with the during because, I don't know. So he wrote 3 different chapters on the same thing about what would happen 3 different ways. So, stuff like that. And that's kind of the way he writes. It's kind of the way the ideas and the broader story kind of flows through him, is sort of like this. And while, yes, it does create a great, awesome story, you kind of have to pick up the pace a little bit. I mean, if Stephen King, a man who's probably right there in age and in reputation with George in all of his great works and all that, if he can still pump out a book or 2 a year, then I mean, there's a reason why he tends to necessarily do that. He's got a lot of other things going on in his life. Like, for instance, he was a main contributor in the Game of Thrones show during the first 4 seasons, even directing and writing, 4 episodes in the first 4 seasons of the show. But not only that, he's very highly involved with every other show that is going to be coming out through HBO about Game of Thrones. Like, for instance, there's an anime going on, there's the House of the Dragon show, he was deeply involved with the Naomi Watts show, and I don't know, there's 4 other shows that are going on right now about Game of Thrones. I mean, HBO is kind of milking this franchise for all it's worth, and George is involved with every spin-off and every show that they are making right now. He is very much involved with all of it. Also, not to bog anything down here, but he also owns a railroad company, he owns a movie theater, and he owns a bookshop. So he's got a lot of spinning plates right now. And the writing stuff kind of takes a back seat when it comes to everything else. That's kind of the reason why he made such a huge amount of writing when the pandemic kind of happened, was because there was literally nothing else for him to do other than write. Now, there is a huge thing going on right now with the writer's strike and the actor's strike happening right now. So, I mean, he can't necessarily write or publish anything script-wise for television and all that type of stuff. So that's a big chunk of his plate kind of off to the side there. So could he write more in this? I mean, he could, technically, if he really wanted to. A big chunk of his plate has been kind of put to the side there. So if the writer's strike can, go on a little further, maybe he can. But here's the thing, he's not commissioned to write anything, but he could write other scripts and not necessarily, publish them, I guess, or give them to HBO. I don't know exactly what the writer's strike is or isn't. I don't necessarily know, how or what he necessarily could do. You can't stop a writer from writing, but you can stop them from publishing it and giving it to, studios and all that. So there's that. I mean, he could obviously do it in the privacy of his home, but he just can't, give it to anybody or show it to anybody. So I don't know. I don't know if he could happen. I don't know if he necessarily could, continue writing his scripts or whatever, but he certainly can't publish them. That's all I know. Also, there's the third aspect, and that is his age. Now, I don't want to be an ageist here. I mean, Stephen King, still to this day, he's in his 70s, probably up there with George. He's still writing, he's still publishing a book a year, basically. At least a book a year, if not two, like giant tomes of books, But again, I mean, comparing George R.R. Martin to Stephen King, not Tolkien, but comparing the two authors is like comparing apples to oranges. I mean, one author they're basically the same fruits, but one tastes completely different from the other. So, but the weird thing is, George did publish other works within the world of Westeros, itself, right? Like, he published Fire and Blood, something that would have been pushed to the side a little bit, but because it's a shorter book, like roughly 600, 700 pages, I mean, he published that work, and he published other works within, the world of Westeros. He just didn't publish Winds of Winter. But with everything going on these days, and, all that stuff kind of, a lot of spinning plates going on these days in George's life, the book is kind of taking a back seat here, okay? And as with many people in their older days, they tend to slow down. Now, the biggest question here: will The Winds of Winter release? And here's the bigger question: will it release before George tragically passes away? Now, it's a little morbid to ask this because, I mean, a person is worth more than the stuff that they do, okay? And the stuff that they're expected to do. I don't want to boil down George's life to this one book, but it's kind of a question that sort of needs to be answered a little bit because, I mean, a lot of Tolkien's works were published, after his death. And a lot of it great, but there's a lot of it that's not necessarily finished. And stuff that, Christopher Tolkien, like George or J.R.R. Tolkien's son, had to write a lot of notes for to kind of explain what exactly is going on within these unfinished tales. Like, for instance, the unfinished tales and all that, So yeah, he was the only one allowed to touch any of J.R.R. Tolkien's works. And later on, I think it's the last one because Chris was on his last legs and eventually, sadly, tragically passed away in 2020. So another editor came in to finalize the publishing of, I think, will be the last book that J.R.R. Tolkien will ever, have his hands on. Chris Tolkien will ever have his hands on. That is the nature of Middle-earth. But as George has said in many, many times over, his work will not be touched by anyone else other than him. Even if he's got kids, even if he's got his wife, even if he's got other people in his estate, no one else is going to touch, the Game of Thrones world. No one will ever touch Westeros other than him. So, here's the deal, and here's the big question, and here's the big answers that we're going to address here. At least in my eyes, with all my research that I have done over the course of me getting into Game of Thrones a little bit more and kind of doing a lot more within the world of Westeros, getting more inspiration from Westeros and all that type of stuff, learning more about the man, the myth, the legend that is George R.R. Martin, and it is this: will we see The Winds of Winter published before George's death. Taking out, the morbidness and all that type of stuff, will we see The Winds of Winter published in its entirety the way George wants it to happen, completely finished before his death? I would say if George doesn't do anything, completely just death-defying, I guess, like, I don't know, go bungee jumping off of a mountain or something, or go scuba diving or something like that, I don't know, the deepest depths of the ocean. If he stays the way he is, and he just writes, and probably with this writer's strike, he's going to be writing a lot more of the book than he is with anything else, because as an author, you want those juices to flow, and you want people to see your work. So, will we see The Winds of Winter published? I would say yes, mainly because a lot of it, up to this point, is already done. In fact, I've watched many times the YouTuber Preston Jacobs' video on the publishing of Winds of Winter and what George has promised and what George has done, and the publication of the novel itself, leading up to this point. So, do I think The Winds of Winter will be published? Yes, I would give it a 80% chance of it actually being published within George's lifespan. I don't want to necessarily say that he's going to die later on, but he's getting up there in age. That's just the way humanity works, unfortunately, unless we transfer his brain to AI or something, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But he's very close. He's also saying that this is going to be the longest book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, which is the Game of Thrones series. This is going to be the longest book, apparently. So, do I think this is going to actually be published? Yes, I think he's going to actually publish this book eventually. Do I think it's going to happen within the next year? No, I don't think so. I would be shocked if it does happen. But I would be the front lines, ready and waiting to get this book if it does come out in the next couple years. But I don't think that's going to happen. I personally would give it, at the very the very latest that this book can come out, I would give it 2025 when this book comes out. I don't think it's going to happen within the year 2023. There's a very high chance this book's not going to come out until through 2024. 2025 is our best bet. I personally would say, by the way George writes, I would say that this book, if it does get published within his lifetime, I would say it would get, more than likely would release in 2027, which is over, it's over 15 years, I would say, since the last book was released. So yes, all in all, I would say 80% chance that this book gets published in its entirety, the way George wants this book to be finished. Now, there is another book in this whole Song of Ice and Fire deal, and that is A Dream of Spring, which is supposedly supposed to wrap up the entire series. Do I think this book will be released in its entirety the way George wants to? No, absolutely not. By the way George is and the way George tends to write, I have little to no hope of this book being released. A lot of fans are speculating that maybe George is also writing A Dream with Spring, and this book will come out along the same lines as The Winds of Winter? No. I highly doubt it. George has even said that he's not writing A Dream of Spring yet. So I have to take his word for it because it's just taking way too long for his next book, The Winds of Winter, to come out. Personally, I'd say we get Fire and Blood 2 over A Dream of Spring coming out. In fact, I think a Fire and Blood 2 would come out before The Winds of Winter. Let's put it that way, okay? This book, the Fire and Blood 2 will happen before Winds of Winter if I know George, which I don't, but if I know George within this realm of BookTube, more than likely we'll get Fire and Blood 2 and all these other books, then The Winds of Winter, before we even get A Dream of Spring. Do I think we're going to get A Dream of Spring before George's death? Absolutely not, unfortunately. I give it a 10 to 20% chance of it actually happening. And the only way it can happen, at least in my eyes, is if George buckles down and writes this book and takes priority with these books over anything else, which he has not done in the past decade. So if this book were to be published, he's going to have to really buckle down. He's really going to have to work on this one thing, this one book, A Dream of Spring, over everything else. And there's no way he's going to do that. In fact, I dare say if I was in his shoes, I wouldn't do that because that would be... I wouldn't want to do that. I would probably wither and die from the lack of sunlight and oxygen if I did that, you know? Do I think A Dream of Spring will happen with George at the helm of it? Absolutely not. I dare say I would be shocked and in awe if this actually happened. Now, will another author come in to finish A Dream of Spring? I would give that a 0% chance if his wife and his estates abide by his wishes. Now, George has expressed tremendously that this will never happen as long as he's around. Game of Thrones is going to happen only by his hand, no one else's. So as long as he has anything to say about it, and I believe his wife, if his wife has anything to say about it, then Game of Thrones will only be penned by his hand. Now, I would say something else here and say this. Will we get kind of George's notes on A Dream of Spring and how it's supposed to wrap up? Probably with an editor or something, giving notes or whatever. Or maybe George is on his deathbed and he's just giving his notes, his letter to the editor and all that, maybe. I would probably put that above anything else. I would give that, and I would say that's more likely. So overall, my predictions for the rest of the Game of Thrones books coming out. If The Winds of Winter comes out the way George wants it to end, I would give it an 80%. Along with George still being alive and at least starting A Dream of Spring. Now, will The Winds of Winter come out with, I don't know, whatever George has right now? Let's say that. Whatever George has right now, will The Winds of Winter come out? I would give that probably the same, 80, maybe 85% chance of that happening. Will A Dream of Spring come out the way George wants it and before George's death, getting out of the morbidness? I would say maybe 10% chance. I highly doubt it. Will The Winds of Winter or A Dream of Spring happen with a different author at the helm to finish these books out? I give an absolute 0% chance. maybe 0.1, maybe. Depends on, I don't know what the future holds. So I know that it won't happen within George R. Martin's lifetime, and I believe it won't happen within his wife's lifetime either. But I don't know what's going to happen after they both pass away. I have no idea. Will A Dream of Spring be published within the realm of maybe George just jots down a few notes and finally, and like, I don't know, his wife or someone from his immediate family comes in and just jots down, like, I don't know, the editor's notes or something to kind of culminate what exactly happens after, the Winds of Winter and all that. I would give that maybe a 70 to 75% chance now that I'm thinking about it further, because the clock is ticking, unfortunately. The time does not slow down, and whether or not I personally want the book to come out sooner is not up to me. It's up to George. And to be perfectly honest, I'd rather this book be good than rushed. So if this book does happen, I think A Dream of Spring would probably happen like this. But again, I really don't know. I don't know. But here's what I have to say on this. I, like many booktubers that are sensible, I would say I would want The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring to come out the right way. I don't want these books to come out and, be rushed or whatever, I don't think George is ever going to rush anything within these books. He's going to make it absolutely flawless, like he has with his previous novels in A Song of Ice and Fire. So far, I'm only a quarter of the way through Game of Thrones currently, but as of right now, it's absolutely flawless. Except for a few minor things that today's day and age, I don't necessarily know. It's kind of like that, that one scene from It, the ending scene from It that everyone knows and everyone's shocked at and no one really likes. There's a few scenes like that, but, all in all, his prose, his storytelling and all that are pretty on par with J.R.R. Tolkien and all that. So, if he is going to release these books, I would want these books to happen the way George wants it to happen. I mean, take the rest of his life. If it takes the rest of his life for these books to come out, I'd rather that happen, I'd rather it happen within George's time rather than, my extremely rushed time and have it just falter at the wind, But anyway, though, guys, those are my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Why don't you comment and let me know? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. And don't forget, more vids coming your way. And hey, take care, guys.